decades, daily life in Papua New Guinea has been nothing short of a relentless nightmare. For men, even a simple shopping trip or a peaceful walk in the park can quickly turn into a mugging, a carjacking, or a savage, unprovoked beating. For women, the dangers are even more severe. A mere stroll outside is often too risky if one wishes to avoid a horrific fate. At the heart of this chaos is an extensive network of gangs known as the Raskols. For years, these violent groups have terrorized communities throughout PNG with minimal interference from law enforcement. They rob, assault, and terrorize at will, effectively ruling their neighborhoods like local warlords. In today's exploration, we're going to delve into the world of the Raskols, a gang whose initiation rituals rank among the most brutal in history, and examine how, in spite of their extreme brutality, they have managed to endure and thrive for decades. To understand the world that produced the Raskols, one must first grasp Papua New Guinea's identity as a nation. Situated just north of Australia, the island of New Guinea is as rugged in its terrain as its history is diverse. Today, the island's divided between two regions, Papua New Guinea in the east and Indonesia in the west. However, this division does not imply a small nation. Papua New Guinea alone is nearly twice the size of the United Kingdom. Despite its vast area, the island's challenging geography, with its dense jungles, towering mountains, and treacherous river valleys, meant that its people remained isolated from one another for much of its history. When the Spanish and Portuguese began arriving in the 1500s, they encountered a scattering of clans and tribes rather than a centralized society or government. They met only a few coastal inhabitants, as they never ventured far enough inland to encounter the highland tribes. The same was true for American and British whaling ships nearly 3 centuries later, which also brushed only the coastal regions. For the most part, the island and its people remains untouched by the outside world well into the modern era. That began to change in the 19th century when European powers scrambled to claim foreign territories. In 1884, Germany declared a protectorate over the northern part of what is now Papua New Guinea, naming it German New Guinea. Just days later, Britain responded by establishing its own protectorate over the southern portion of the island, along with several nearby smaller islands, and named their territory Papua. Despite these colonial claims, the island's highland regions remained largely undisturbed during this period, with foreign interests mainly focused along the coasts. Even after Britain transferred its portion to the Australian government at the start of the 20th century, and following Germany's defeat in World War I, when their territory also came under Australian control, the highlands continued to be isolated. In fact, it wasn't until the 1920s that foreigners began venturing into the mountainous interior. It was the discovery of gold along the Bololo River that pushed further exploration into Papua New Guinea's remote interior. Soon after came an even more astonishing finding. Nearly 1 million people living in isolated communities, some so secluded that they'd never even encountered another tribe, let alone a European or Australian. Then World War II arrived, introducing modern warfare to a people who were, in many ways, still living in the Stone Age. For more than 3 years, New Guinea became a critical battleground in the Pacific theater until the Japanese surrender in August 1945. The war left a lasting impact, reshaping the island's landscape, its people, and its future. In the post-war years, Australia merged the former British and German territories to form what would eventually become Papua New Guinea. The nation went on to gain independence in 1975. Yet, as was so common in post-colonial transitions, it was at that very moment, just as self-rule began, that PNG found itself in urgent need of outside support. And this is how modern Papua New Guinea came to be, a nation where the vast majority of people still live in rural areas, with only about 13% residing in cities. It is a country so geographically and culturally fragmented that despite having an estimated population of just around 10 million people, a figure that is difficult to pin down precisely, it is home to over 840 distinct languages, which accounts for more than 10% of all the languages still spoken in the world today. Imagine the challenge of uniting this immense patchwork of cultures and tribes under a single national identity, all governed by a centralized state. For some, particularly those living along the coasts, the idea of nationhood and formal governance was at least somewhat familiar, but for many, especially those in the highlands, it meant little. Their traditional ways of life have persisted, largely untouched even into the modern era. The result was a government disconnected from its people, lacking a unifying vision, and plagued by instability from the very beginning. In urban centres like the capital, Port Moresby, as well as in cities such as Lye and Mountain Hagen, gang violence quickly became a brutal part of daily life. Meanwhile, in the Highlands, life continued much as it always had, with no electricity, no running water, and many mountain clans just persisted in their traditional conflicts, largely unchecked by a law enforcement system that remained focused on the cities. Even then, few could trust the legal system, as corruption permeated just about every level of government. For citizens trying to earn an honest living, the odds were stacked impossibly high. Mass unemployment was a crisis from the start, and the gap between the rich and the poor grew so vast that many ended up living in shanty towns or directly on the streets. A small elite, enriched by control over the country's resources, routinely exploited the vulnerable. Both children and adults were pulled from the streets and trafficked into forced labor, whether in logging camps, mines, or the sex trade. With survival as the top priority, many families were compelled to send their children out alone, hoping that they could contribute somehow, regardless of the risks. Now, as is often the case in times of deep crisis, people began to find their own ways to survive. In Papua New Guinea, survival took the form of the Raskol gangs, which began to emerge in the 70s. Boys of all ages were drawn into criminal activity, joining gangs as one of the few available means of income, protection, and support. Reflecting the fragmented nature of their homeland, no single dominant gang emerged. Instead, various groups took shape, such as the Boma, the 585s, the Mafia, KGK, and Kips Kaboni, all collectively known as Raskols. The term derives from tok pisin, the local English-based Creole used in commerce and government, where Raskol means rascal, just with an O instead of an A. As the Raskols gained power in cities across PNG, they brought with them increased violence, corruption, and lawlessness. Over time, these gangs not only influenced the streets, but also began to dominate them to the point where they essentially controlled the nation's urban landscape. In the Highlands, much of the violence and crime remains rooted in intertribal warfare. For instance, on July 10, 2019, one such conflict claimed the lives of 32 people, including 9 children. While these clashes are a primary driver of crime in rural areas, cities like Port Moresby must contend with nearly every other form of criminal activity. This is largely due to the presence and influence of the Raskols. Raskol gangs are responsible for a wide range of crimes, from robberies and carjackings to kidnappings and assaults, often using a combination of locally sourced, black market, and homemade weapons. These gangs patrol the streets with impunity, and it's not uncommon to see groups armed with machetes holding up both tourists and locals alike. Even more alarming are armed robberies involving weapons as heavy as M16 assault rifles. It's no surprise that these crimes persist, considering many gang members can earn more from a single robbery than they might in a lifetime of legitimate work. Some of the more organized gangs have even expanded their operations to include international arms trafficking, frequently exchanging local-grown cannabis or other drugs, many of which aren't widely used in Papua New Guinea. In fact, despite the country's numerous challenges, drug use remains relatively low because cannabis is primarily cultivated as a trade commodity rather than for domestic consumption. On the streets, there are individuals who specialize in crafting homemade firearms for the Raskols, which are frequently used in attacks against police, unsuspecting civilians, and rival gangs. Gang warfare in Papua New Guinea is often open and relentless, erupting in public shootouts, brutal daylight murders, revenge killings, and everything in between. For anyone hoping that local governments might step in to restore law and order, the reality is grim. There's simply little hope. In many areas, the Raskols are the law. Through widespread bribery and corruption, much of the police force and government administration operate under the gang's influence. Even worse, many officers are directly involved in criminal activities themselves, ranging from fuel theft to arms trafficking. These officers can be just as violent and unpredictable as the gangs they are supposed to fight, often turning on civilians without hesitation. For the people living in PNG cities, safety isn't even an illusion. However, this danger extends well past the local population, as there have been multiple cases of foreigners falling prey to Raskol violence. In 2013, an American man, his wife, and a tour guide were researching climate change and its impact on the region's birds when they were attacked by 9 gang members armed with knives and guns. The gang stripped the man and his guide and tied them to a tree, forcing them to watch as they spent the next 20 minutes scalping the man's wife. The only thing that saved her was a stray noise in the forest that startled the gang, allowing the victims to break free and run for help. This horrific incident occurred just a week after an Australian tourist endured a similar fate when a gang viciously killed her friend. Unfortunately, acts of sexual assault, rape, and other atrocities are all too common throughout PNG, both in the highlands and in urban centres. In one widely reported case from 2003, after a woman was injured in a car accident, a local group of rascals dragged her from the wrecked vehicle and ganged her while she lay injured and dying. Tragically, this type of assault has become a disturbingly common tactic among rascal gangs, so much so that it now forms a recognizable part of their modus operandi. So, to put it as mildly as possible, is more than just a frequently committed crime by the Raskols, it is a core element of their identity. Any young man who wishes to join one of these gangs must undergo an initiation that typically involves finding a random young woman and forcing himself on the victim. That's it. There is no curb stomping, there is no shooting of a rival gang member, or any of these similar initiation rituals usually prevalent in gangs around the world. Instead, rascals are ordered to commit one of the worst actions imaginable against an innocent victim who has nothing to do with their group. Peter Moses, or one of the leaders of the 585s, has stated that raping a young woman is a mandatory act for any young gang member looking to prove himself. Moses, who has openly admitted to assaulting over 30 victims, 3 of whom ended up dead, has been quoted on the matter as saying, "And it is better if a boy kills her afterwards. There will be less problems with the police." Meanwhile, in the Highlands, women often face similarly harsh conditions and are frequently treated more like property than they are people. In many cases, marriage involves the payment of a bride price, a transaction in which the woman is effectively sold off, much like an old car. Once this exchange is complete, the husband is free to treat his wife however he pleases. As a result, many women throughout PNG endure regular domestic abuse, sexual assault by their partners, and in some cases, even worse. Tragically, some women are targeted not only by their husbands, but by their entire communities. Belief in witchcraft remains widespread in the Highlands, and women are often accused of practicing puripuri, or black magic. When such accusations arise, families may disown the accused out of fear of being cursed or punished by association. Consequently, these women are forced to flee their homes or face brutal punishments, often culminating in violent attacks by local mobs. In 2012, Vlad Sokin released the documentary Crying Marie, in which he traveled to Papua New Guinea to document the widespread mistreatment of women across the country. What he uncovered was tragic, though by then, all too unsurprising. Many of the young rascals he interviewed openly and proudly admitted to at least one woman, with several boasting of even more. When asked why they'd never been reported, most explained that none of their victims had gone to the police. Disturbed by these revelations, Sokin decided to dig deeper. He sought out the victims to hear their side of the story. Most of the women he spoke with said they had indeed tried to file reports, only to have their complaints lost in a corrupt system, dismissed by police who had been bribed by the Raskols or ignored because the victims lacked the money to pay off officers. This in turn exposed an entirely separate yet equally alarming issue: systemic corruption and a justice system inaccessible to those without power or money. According to the Raskols themselves, the police have been just as cruel and violent as the gangs, often venting their frustrations on local communities. They may well be right, as police brutality is widespread across the country, with authorities frequently adopting a beat first, ask questions later approach. As Koiva, a Bomai gang member, remarked in 2004, "The police we know are very dangerous. They come in the settlement and raid people's food and property and beers." By now, the police have effectively become a gang of their own, often relying on bribes for a living. In addition to the crimes already mentioned, they have been implicated in human trafficking and are known to assault civilians on the street, frequently mirroring the behavior of the Raskols. In the Highlands, where regulations are even more lax than in the cities, police misconduct can be especially severe. Officers have been reported assaulting young detainees, stripping unsuspecting citizens naked before robbing them, and engaging in even more egregious acts than that. While most modern nations have government bodies that oversee and punish such abuses, the judicial and criminal system in Papua New Guinea operates very differently. Despite being severely under-resourced, the Royal Papua New Guinea Constabulary reports solely to the Ministry of Defence, effectively granting the police unchecked authority. Similarly underfunded, the courts often lead to trial delays, wrongful imprisonment, and prolonged detentions without due process. Expectations for the prison system should remain low. Even though PNG's prisons have one of the highest occupancy rates in Oceania, they are overcrowded, poorly maintained, and notoriously violent. Riots, escapes, and acts of brutality are common, and it is widely believed that, like the police, prison guards can be easily bribed. To say that the Raskols have left a lasting impact on Papua New Guinea is a major understatement. At one point, the murder rate in Port Moresby was reported to be 3 times higher than that of Moscow and 23 times higher than London. Adding to the violence, the country also faces a severe STD epidemic fueled, in large part, by widespread sexual assault, a factor that has contributed to the steady rise in HIV and AIDS cases nationwide. As of 2020, more than 50,000 people in PNG were living with the disease. However, experts believe these figures are heavily underreported, and many fear that the real numbers will surge dramatically in the years ahead. For years, the very existence of the Raskols went unnoticed by the wider world, let alone the atrocities they were committing in a remote corner of the Pacific Ocean. That changed in 2004 when Australian photographer and author Stephen DuPont travelled to Papua New Guinea to document the situation for himself. While there, he managed to infiltrate the Kipskaboni Tok Pisin for Scar Devils, PNG's longest established gang, after earning their trust. Remarkably, he was allowed to set up shop in their safe house where he documented their unique homemade weapons and firearms. At the time, the Kipskaboni were embroiled in a gang war, and DuPont was given full access to witness it unfold. Allegedly, the violence was ignited when a Motu woman was killed by a Highlander who drove a metal spear through her neck, triggering a brutal vendetta. In retaliation, the Kipskaboni launched attacks on Highlanders, burning down their stores and properties. Despite being an outsider, DuPont was granted the rare opportunity to photograph freely and even conduct individual profiles of the gang members. One of the gang members that DuPont profiled, a man named Omzi, later appears in the documentary Crying Marie. In the film, Omzi reveals that since DuPont's visit to Papua New Guinea, he has turned his life around. He left the gang to become a bass player in a band that was beginning to gain international attention. Despite his new path, he expresses deep shame about the person he was when DuPont made the original 2004 profile. Omzi admits that during his time with the gang, he worked 5 different women and regularly held his wife at knife and gunpoint to get his way. Despite this behavior being common among the gang members, DuPont was surprised to find that many in the community viewed the Raskols as heroes. Much like modern-day Robin Hoods, some saw them as necessary criminals defying a corrupt system and standing up for the powerless. However, this perception is seriously misguided. Although Papua New Guinea does struggle with systemic corruption, it does not justify the Raskols' abominable, violent, and deeply harmful actions. Rather than truly defending the people, these gangs have significantly contributed to many of the modern challenges facing the nation. In recent years, leaders like Prime Minister James Marape have made meaningful progress in combating corruption. In 2020, the government passed a bill to establish an independent commission against corruption, marking the country's first major step toward addressing the issue through formal regulation. Additionally, efforts have been made to raise awareness about drug use in schools through assemblies and other educational initiatives. Meanwhile, at the community level, organizations such as City Mission's New Life Farm continue to operate largely independently, providing support through shelters, outreach programs, and various forms of community engagement. However, many of these efforts remain largely ineffective, as there has been little progress in enacting robust legislation to combat issues such as human trafficking, arms trafficking, or gang violence, problems that are directly related to the Raskols. To this day, they continue to dominate the cities, terrorizing residents at will, committing atrocities, and transforming entire areas into war zones. In short, they persist as ruthless figures of terror, and unless significant changes are made, they will likely continue to control their communities with little opposition for the foreseeable future. Thank you for watching.